Conference, fishing is the very lifeblood of the communities that I'm privileged to represent in Banff and Buchan. In the 1970s, when the UK joined the then EEC, the fishing industry was betrayed by a UK government that considered them expendable. That sellout has had enormous repercussions over recent decades, compounded by the failures of a common fisheries policy that's really not fit for purpose. It's caused enormous social, economic and environmental damage, and even with recent reforms it remains deeply flawed. It cannot be right that more than half of the fish in Scottish waters is being caught and landed by foreign vessels, and we should not be afraid to say that. But it also really shouldn't surprise us that so many people in our fishing communities voted to leave the EU. Their reasons are not so hard to understand. They look enviously at their neighbours in Norway and Iceland, who speak for themselves in crucial negotiations and defend their own interests from outside the EU but within the single market. And I think that's a crucial point, because I don't believe for one second that all those folk who voted for Brexit voted to be dragged out of the single market. Most people understand that it's overwhelmingly in the interests of all our food producers to have access to their international trade. And our membership of the single market brings that for us. For many people, that's a more important question than whether or not they are part of an EU member state or not. Last year, almost 80% of Scotland's fish and seafood exports went to EU countries. That's fish worth over £438 million. From outside the single market, we would almost certainly face hefty tariffs and perhaps even more damaging non-tariff barriers. They would reduce our competitiveness, and it would be an absolute bonanza for our competitors in the north. They can export to the EU as of right. Outside the single market, our processing sector in particular faces real uncertainty and acute labour shortages. Even some of the most ardent Brexiteers I've met in the fishing sector have told me that they support the benefits of freedom of movement and what that brings to the industry. Thousands of EU citizens are now working in our fish factories, living in our communities, most of them from the Baltic states, with whom we've had ancient trading relationships over many centuries, Poland, Lithuania and Latvia. Many of them have now married and settled here. But the current uncertainty over their future status, the toxic rhetoric we've had in the media and in Parliament on immigration, and the rise in hate crime is causing enormous anguish and distress. I think we need to say to these people very loudly and clearly, you're welcome in Scotland. We value your contribution, and we recognise the role you play in sustaining our industries, and not least in anchoring local jobs in our rural communities. We will fight to defend your rights, just as we will fight for all our other citizens. Conference, amidst the current chaos and economic turmoil of Brexit, there's a window of opportunity to redress the historic injustices perpetrated in our fishing communities. But there are also risks that a hard Brexit that drags us out of the single market would cause untold damage to our onshore industry. Our fishing grounds are an abundant natural resource, and we've had duty to manage them sustainably and in the interests of our people. We need to fight for our own interests, for the interests of our fishing communities, and never, ever again let our London Tory government use our fishermen as an expendable bargaining chip. Please, Conference, support the resolution.